Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to Cavirin's Implementing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Shouldn't Be Scary. And if you celebrate Halloween, happy Halloween to all of you. Today, we have two very skilled presenters. The first, covering some of the background, market drivers, and just the general framework, would be Anupam Sahai, who's our VP of Product Management, very deep expertise across SaaS, cybersecurity, risk management, and data science. And then second, diving into the framework itself and how you actually implement the mappings, is Praveen Goel, who is our head of information security compliance, a master of all things CIS, benchmarks, and frameworks, and in fact, he had authored the Docker benchmark, Kubernetes, and is taking a leadership role in CIS on developing hardening benchmarks for both GCP as well as Azure. Some housekeeping. First of all, excuse me, a little bit delay there. We're going to upload the slide deck along with some accompanying information after the live webinar, so please check back on BrightTalk. Second, you have a tab that says questions from the audience. Please ask any questions. And if we don't get to them during the live webinar, we'll answer them one-on-one. And third, you can find more information at our landing page, Solutions NIST-Support. So with that, Anupam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. So today's agenda that we will cover, we will start out by talking about the cybersecurity landscape and how things are getting more and more intense and scary. And then we talk about the need for another framework. Why is there a need for a NIST Cybersecurity Framework? We will provide a quick overview and the guidance from the program, from the framework, to establish information security or a cybersecurity program. We will also talk about NIST 800-171 and other frameworks that NIST CSF interoperates or works together with, and take you through some of the best practices for implementing NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And then I will turn it over to Praveen to take you through the details of how to actually map the NIST CSF controls to actual checks and assessments so that you can implement it and realize it in your environment. And at the end, we will do a Q&A. So that's the agenda for today. Before I start, let me first show you a screen a website that I love a lot. It kind of tells you the latest state of affairs on a daily basis based on all the breaches that are happening, and this is updated on a daily basis. So what you see here is on the left-hand side is a timeline, and the bubbles here show the different breaches that are happening on a regular basis. And mind you, these are breaches that exceed 30,000 records. So it's a big data breach that's only being counted here. So you see some of the familiar names: Equifax, 143 million records; Riverside Media, which was about 1.37 billion records; Anthem Blue Cross, that happened near the end of 2016, and you can see here the bubbles are getting crowded in 2017. So the problem is getting worse by the day. And that's a cause for worry, because we want to make sure that as an organization, we are prepared and ready for any such attacks or breaches that show no sign of relenting. In fact, in 2017, there have been 918 breaches, leading to about 2 billion records being breached just in the first 6 months of 2007, which is pretty much the same amount that happened. About 2 billion records were breached in the entire 2016 calendar year. And the year before, again, there was 100% growth. So the breaches, the data records getting impacted are literally doubling, if not tripling every year, and it's very expensive. The cost of a breach can be anywhere between $2 million to $6.3 million. This is just the cost to recover from a breach, not to mention the brand damage and the penalties and the civil lawsuits that the breach brings about. So you see here at a high level, the top level breaches that have happened in this century. Certainly Equifax and Anthem Blue Cross top the list, and the number of records that are breached, you can see here, if you were to look at from a perspective of whether it's personal information, which is a green bar here, or credentials, the total records that were breached in 2016 was about 2 billion, growing up from the year before. And as I mentioned earlier today, that in 2017, the first 6 months of 2017, we're already up to about 2 billion records. So the another pretty scary element is that the attackers are very sophisticated. They are organized groups, or they are organized nations that are stealing the data. It takes seconds and minutes to steal the data, and it takes weeks, months, if not years, to detect and contain the breach. And to detect a breach, it takes about 6 months on average, and then to recover from that is about another 2 months. So you're talking about anywhere between 9 months after the breach has happened. On an average, an organization is able to understand that they were breached and recover from it. So it might be too late by then to be able to recover from the data that was already lost and beyond the periphery of the enterprise. So let's look into what kind of incidents or breaches are happening. On the left, you see are the different breaches that are affecting companies, and they fall into 10 different categories. And if you look into the incidents, which is really a breach can be mapped into multiple incidents before the data gets stolen. Really, it's around web-related denial of service attacks. Crimeware is related to ransomware. Privilege misuse is because of insider abuse of the credentials, and so on and so forth. So these patterns tell us that most of these attacks or incidents are happening because of these 10 different categories of breaches, breach types, or breach patterns, or attack vectors that need to be curbed or dealt with. So if we dive further into this, we notice that the type of breaches that are happening are who's behind the breaches. About 75% of the breaches are happening because of external attackers, and that's the scary part, because it's sometimes confused with the fact that and only 25% are due to internal actors, and most of the breaches happen due to hacking and malware. So 62% due to hacking, 51% due to malware, and 81% due to stolen or data or weak passwords. And the victims are really financial organizations. The top victims are financial organizations, healthcare organizations, and public sector entities. And the primary motive, as you can see on the picture on the right side, is financial motive. And the next leading cause for active threat motive for breaches is espionage, which is related to intellectual property stealing or just secret stealing. So all of these paint a pretty damning picture of the reasons why the actors are incentivized to steal the data and make financial gains or espionage gains because of all these different attack vectors. Now, the good news in all of this gloomy data is that studies have shown, the recent HP survey and other from the Verizon breach report, which is the kind of the gospel for breach study information, that 97% of these breaches were avoidable using simple or intermediate controls. So as an organization, there's a lot that can be done, some very simple things that can be done to understand and mitigate and deal with these cyber breaches. So that's really where we are headed to. And in fact, in December 2014, the government enacted the Cybersecurity Act of 2014, which is focused around protecting critical infrastructure in the country. And the critical infrastructure here could mean electricity, waterworks, manufacturing, high-tech, anything that's on the internet, which pretty much results in every infrastructure is on the internet, and thereby is prone to being attacked and compromised. So the question comes, why is there a need for another framework? And this is an important question. The government, when they enacted the law in December 2014, entrusted the NIST body, which is the standards body, to come up with a framework which was all-encompassing and be able to deal with a cybersecurity process that would enable organizations to fortify and defend themselves against these cyber attackers. And so the purpose of the framework is to provide a common taxonomy, a common framework that allows organizations to understand their current posture, how ready are they to deal with the attackers, what's the robustness of the cybersecurity program, and then identify and prioritize for improvement the target profile or the target goals, set target goals to prevent any cyber breaches from happening and deal with it in a very efficient manner. And then measure progress as you move towards the desired target goal. So these are the broad objectives that the framework provides, and it also allows you to create a common vocabulary so that you can communicate internally and externally with about risk. And the framework requirements does not complement, it does not replace an organization's existing program. It's only replacing or complementing that. So and what the framework provides are a set of standards, methodologies, and procedures and processes that allows organizations to implement a robust cybersecurity program. It's applicable for any size, any sector of the critical infrastructure. Organization may or may not have a mature cybersecurity program. They can adopt and implement what they have and complement that with the cybersecurity framework, or they can start afresh with a new program using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So what are the different components? There are three different components that comprise the cybersecurity. There is the framework core, which is really a set of industry standards and guidelines and best practices that allow an organization to implement info security or information security program internally. The tiers, the framework implementation tiers is really describing the maturity or lack thereof of an organization from a cybersecurity readiness perspective, and we talk about that. And finally, the framework profile is really the desired outcome or desired posture that the business needs to be at so that they can claim that they have a robust information security program. So as you can see, there are different levels of progression. Organization may start at level 1 or level 2 or level 3 or level 4, and really the implementation tiers describe the maturity of the organization from a risk management program and stakeholders' perspective, how mature the program is, which would drive and govern where in the spectrum of in terms of implementation tiers that an organization is. So the endeavor would be to start at whatever level you are, 1 or 2, and move up the tiers to make the organization more mature and make it more repeatable, more adaptive from a process and implementation point of view. So let's jump ahead and dive in terms of what's there in the core set of frameworks. There are 5 functions that are defined in in the core framework, and they pertain to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. These are the broad classifying functions, and really they form, or any robust information security program needs to have these 5 stages before they can really say that they have a robust program. And each of these 5 stages are asking a different set of questions to help enable the organization to better understand what are the assets that need protection. And so the identify stage is really looking at governance processes and critical business assets that need protection, and that's achieved through these different categories of controls, as it were, related to asset management, business environment, governance, etc. Similarly, the protect is really around safeguards and controls that are in place to protect the critical information, the critical data, and that pertains to these different categories: access control, awareness, data security. Similarly, detect is looking at what are the incident management capabilities in the system, in the program, to detect an intrusion, detect an anomaly that will indicate or signal that there is a breach happening or a breach could happen. So this is really the part of the process that allows us to detect any problems that might be coming up. And then response is really a way to deal with a breach and essentially understand and contain the impact of a breach, and recover allows us to recover from a breach, which can again need a lot of planning, recovery planning, disaster recovery planning, and things like that. So all these 5 stages are required as a part of a robust information security program. And what you see here is a further information on each of the controls categories are essentially a list of controls that are security controls that an organization needs to put in place so that they can implement a robust information security program. And as I mentioned earlier, these controls can be mapped or can be achieved through a number of existing standards and regulations. So for example, you have references here to COBIT, ISO 27K, NIST SP 853, which is FISMA. So all these controls can be implemented using any of these frameworks that are out there. If you have implemented any of these frameworks, you need to look at it from the perspective of the NIST CFF and then decide what's missing, what's lacking, and you can continue the journey by essentially translating those controls into a list of requirements or list of security controls or risk management controls that drive the robustness of the program. And Praveen will take you through some of this mapping in a later stage. So now this is the core element. This is the process that's recommended by NIST Cybersecurity Program, and there are 7 stages to the process. And I'll briefly describe this. The objective of this process is to create a repeatable process that allows you to assess your current security posture. It allows you to understand your baseline posture and then create a target destination profile, which is where the organization needs to be, and establishes a set of steps that allows you to move from your current baseline to your target profile baseline by doing this assessment, understanding the gaps, and remediating a number of issues that are found, and thereby you create this repeatable, adaptive process in your organization to implement a robust information security program. The centerpiece of that process is the risk management element, risk assessment and management element. And let me spend a few minutes on this because this itself could be the subject of a complete webinar. But suffice it to say, what risk assessment is doing is trying to understand your current security and risk posture, and it does so by asking these 3 critical questions. It's asking you a question about what are your critical assets and what are the threats that are relevant for those critical assets to be compromised, and what happens if your critical assets get compromised, and what's the likelihood impact of this happening. So if you are able to answer these questions in the context of your organization and put together mitigating controls that allows you to essentially deal with these different variables that is part of the NIST risk management model, then you are fairly mature as an information security program. And again, you can use ISO or NIST to do your risk assessment. The framework does not restrict you from adopting any one or the other standard format, but the basic questions around critical assets, the threats that are affecting it, and the vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and what are the likelihood impacts of such a exploit from happening. Those questions don't change. The security controls may alter and vary time to time. So given the background about what the NIST CSF framework does, now we're going to show you the steps required to implement and to enforce and adopt a CSF program using an automated solution from Cavirin. And Cavirin allows you to create a robust, automated, continuous monitoring program for cybersecurity and risk management. And it supports a combination of infrastructures that could be on the cloud, on premises, or Docker container-related DevOps resources. It doesn't matter, and you're able to implement a virtuous cycle of automation to discover, to do group assets, to assess, remediate, and do continuous monitoring based on any scheduling, the automated scheduling that you want to do. So with that, let me turn it over to Praveen to take you through the logistics of how to implement and realize CSF in your organization. Praveen, please.
Thanks, Anupam. I would like to start with the question from audience, which says that there is a measurement recommended by NIST, so which is not that rigorous at the moment. So how do you take care of this aspect? So this is exactly what I'm trying to talk right now, that how you can address the gap and how you can actually measure your security against various CSF controls depending on the target. So yeah, just hear it very closely. So let's talk about how do you actually map the NIST Cybersecurity Framework to actual target of evaluation. Because if you look at the NIST guidelines, they are good, but if you just follow them, you don't really get anything out of it. So for example, your target of evaluation could be a Red Hat Linux server, it could be a Windows server, it could be your desktops, or it could be your Amazon account or your Azure subscription. So what you need to do first is to identify the various target of evaluations that you have in your infrastructure. And then choose your security baseline for the target. Now, the security baselines can come from sources like CIS, DISA, or other industry-accepted best practices. Once you have chosen your security baseline for the target to match the target of evaluation capabilities, then you need to map the baseline to the NIST controls. I know this is hard, but that is what you need to do. Once you have done that, let's go through the various steps that we have to follow. So first, for example, let's take the identify function, right? So in this identify function, it helps the organization to identify in a scope their cybersecurity elements. It provides a unified mechanism to prioritize and scope the on-premise infrastructure components as well as the cloud resources. The first step is to discover these resources that you have in your infrastructure, right? And then you have to map it to various subcategories and then to the actual control elements. For example, in this case, if you look, we have an identified category which talks about that asset vulnerabilities are identified. And then on the right-hand side, you have various controls that we have derived from security baseline such as CIS for Red Hat Linux 7. So if you are on a Red Hat Linux 7 and then you are working with this identified category, those are some of the security controls provided by security benchmarks that you can map against. Now the next one is that once you have identified those assets and vulnerabilities, as I showed you in my previous slide, then you map it to the actual controls based on the target of evaluation. So now there are various steps provided by NIST to how to go about doing this. The first one is to prioritize and scope. So in this step, the organization identifies the scope of the cybersecurity elements. So it could include your on-premises elements such as operating system, network devices, etc., or it could be your cloud resources such as Amazon account or Azure subscription. Once you have identified the scope, then the next step is to orient it. So by orientation, we mean is that it includes identifying departments and units and what infrastructure elements each is using. For example, you can create various asset groups to reflect the organization units and segregate infrastructure elements based on department. For example, you could discover a range of machines and segregate them into department or organization units, such as you could have an HR department, you could have an IT department, you could have developers, etc. Right? So then you can orient your resources according to various departments. So that's the next step. The next step is to then create a current profile. So now you have to identify that, okay, once you have oriented your resources or your cybersecurity elements, how do they look like today, right? So you need to have some kind of an assessment of your various resources against the cybersecurity risk. So that's step number 3, and you try to find out that how do your assets look like today. Then the next step is to create a risk assessment. So for example, if you are using Caverin's product or any other product for that matter, you could identify the various risks associated with your resources, and you can find out that what are the various cybersecurity risks you have right now that you have to fix. And then you have to choose your target profile, that if your target profile should be like, okay, you want to be 60% compliant, 80% compliant, or 100% compliant. For example, if you are dealing with patches, you wouldn't want to miss a single patch. But if you're dealing with other configuration level issues, there might be a few exceptions based on your site or infrastructure requirement. So basically, you need to decide that what is the target profile that you are heading towards or that you are aiming for. Once you have identified the target, then the next step is to prioritize the gaps. So from step number 5, where you identified the target profile and the risk assessment, you have to find out that what are the various control gaps, and then find out what are the various control requirements that you need to implement as a fix. And of course, the last step is to implement the action plan. So you could do it via your DevOps processes, where you have identified the gaps and then you have integrations like Chef or Puppet or anything of that sort. Or if you are still old school, you could implement it via things like GPOs or automated shell scripts on job. So the last step is to implement the action plan and make sure that your cybersecurity risk for each of your target of evaluation, it could be a Linux server, a Windows server, a cloud account, or subscription, is handled. With this, I would like to turn it back to Anupam.
Thank you, Praveen. So let's spend a few minutes talking about NIST 800-171, which is the standard from NIST for protecting CUI, controlled unclassified information, in non-federal systems and organizations. Essentially what this is describing is a set of controls or security requirements for non-federal entities to meet federal mandates and for sharing of information. So in other words, if there's any company or organization that contracts with the federal government and handles processes or stored sensitive government information, they need to comply with SP 171. And the last date for being compliant is year-end, December 31st, 2017. And so there are about 110 control requirements that are part of 800-171, and they are different tiers, basic or derived, and essentially they're coming from a set of publications from FIPS and the 853, which is the FISMA guidance. So anyway, the federal organizations are required to be FISMA compliant. This is for non-government or quasi-government entities and agencies that need to interact or share information with the government agencies. And so from an implementation perspective, Cavirin have a control framework that implements 800-171. There are a number of checks, which we call policies, that are implemented by Cavirin, that allows you to look at all the different requirements coming from 800-171, and you can then assess all your resources against this control framework and come out with a answer, your security posture, and the level of compliance with 800-171. And it's a completely automated solution that I talked about earlier that allows you to get visibility, assess your resources, and you get remediation guidance on how to fix the open issues, and then you can do continuous monitoring and measure your drift from the state's compliance or your security posture. So it's a completely automated tool that allows you to manage your security and risk posture. So I know we covered a lot of information today, but to summarize, clearly cyber attackers are not going away. In fact, it's accelerating, and we need to use a framework like NIST CSF, which is a broader framework which gives you a lot of options to pick and choose your control frameworks, whether you use ISO, NIST, COBIT. You can choose your security control framework and create and implement the cybersecurity framework with continuous monitoring. Certainly risk analysis, security risk analysis is the center of all of this. And again, implementing a NIST risk management process or an ISO-based risk management process is the centerpiece of any robust information security program. And we urge you to look at and consider Cavirin to deal with your cybersecurity and risk management needs. So with that, let us pause here and see whether there are any questions from the audience. Please type in your questions in the question from the audience section of your screen.
And while we're waiting for questions to come in, just as an aside, for anyone that's on the live webinar or has signed up ahead of time, as follow-up, we've created an infographic that looks at the detailed mapping and workflow that Praveen just covered. We'll send that or a link to that out to everybody. We have one question in. So maybe this is to Praveen or to Anupam. Why is it still a draft, and when do we expect it to be final?
That's right. So what, can you say the first part of the question again? What is to be addressed? I didn't quite get that.
Why is the framework still a draft, and when do we expect it to go final?
Okay, got it. I can take that, and Praveen, you can add to it perhaps. So that's right. This is a draft version 1.1. The first version came out a couple of years ago, and this version is still being worked on. For example, some of the issues around the maturity model, etc., is still being debated. And the purpose is really to provide a framework with implementation guidelines. And I think we have still maybe a few months, if not a couple of years away from a complete agreed-to draft. But again, we don't have to wait to implement this. The core implementation strategy is around risk management, around target profiles that you want the company to be achieving, and it provides you with the processes and the control frameworks that you can adopt right away to implement a robust program. But the implementation guidance from NIST CSF may still be a while away. Cavirin, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that any decision about the timing of updates or any frequency is solely driven by NIST and the community and contributors. So it's not something that we can control. And NIST gets a lot of feedback from various communities. So it does take a lot of time for a standard to move from draft to final. So I think by early next year, we should have that as a final thing available.
Okay, there's another question that came in dealing with implementation tiers. And Anupam, earlier in the presentation, you covered 1 through 4, partial, risk-informed, repeatable, and adaptive. And the question is, is it something, does an organization need to aspire to be at the 4th tier, or is it there a different tier for different types of organizations where they can find their sweet spot but don't have to be all the way over to the right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So think of the tiers as more of a capability maturity model that you want to strive to be at the highest tier. And the idea is that you may start out at any particular tier and work your way up. The exact definition of and the metrics for a mature tier or level 4 tier implementation is still not there, not specified. But the idea is that you set up targets from a target profile perspective, your risk, you're assessing risk, you're setting target risk scores that you want to achieve, and ensure that all the processes required to manage and maintain and improve your posture keeps on improving over the years. But the metrics today are more relevant or more coming in from frameworks like COBIT or ISO or the NIST risk management framework, which can be used as a reference till NIST CSF comes up with its own metrics.
Okay, there's 4 more questions that just came in. I'll go through them one by one, and either of you can answer. First, where is the data for the framework housed?
Not that question. So is it like, where is the PDF file, or is there more to the question?
Where is the data for the framework housed? Maybe I'll answer that in that if you go onto the NIST website, there's a whole microsite there that talks about the framework, shows the spreadsheet that Anupam dive into. There are all the various normative references that the NIST framework references, and there are also a number of industry and vendor documents showing alignment to the framework. For example, Cavirin, we have published, and it's on the NIST site, a mapping guideline between the framework and what we can do. And it's about a 35, 40-page document. You can reference that and see how things are going. The second question was, how long would it typically take to implement the NIST framework?
Yeah, so I'm actually showing you the cybersecurity framework Excel sheet that's available from the website that Dave talked about, where you can see on the left-hand side the functions are color-coded, identify, protect, and for each of the functions, there are categories, subcategories, and references to control frameworks that can be used to implement this. So there is some guidance, but the maturity model, for example, is not completely specified, and so there's some work to be done there. Now, going back to the time it will take, it really depends on your current implementation of an information security program. If you already have a robust risk management program, then it's really a question of validating against the requirements that by adopting one of these frameworks, whether ISO or NIST or COVID, and then measuring against what the gaps are today from the specified destination as per these frameworks, and figuring out how far you are there today, and then working your way up to ensure that you measure the gaps, prioritize it, remediate them, and keep doing this as you improve your risk posture and cybersecurity posture. So I'm afraid the answer is dependent on the maturity or the implementation state of the current organization that you're part of. And if you have any specific questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be able to work with you and help you calibrate and implement something like this in your organization.
Okay, two more general questions and then some Cavern-specific ones. One, the cost of the framework, and second, how many companies have adopted this framework either in the U.S. or worldwide?
So, as I said, the framework is really putting together a set of elements or steps in a robust cybersecurity program, and this is putting together and leveraging existing standards like ISO, NIST, and COVID, which are very widely deployed and implemented. So it's really cobbling together a cohesive and a coherent framework that is very robust. And in terms of the number of companies that are implementing it today, I may not have the numbers, but NIST and COVID and ISO are very widely deployed in all sectors of the industry today.
Okay, and before I go in, there's two Cavern-specific questions that came in. One other question. At Internet Issues Late is a presentation will be available online for review. Of course, we'll have the slides as well as Bright Talk actually has the complete webinar recording. We also cross-post the MP4 into YouTube, and we'll send a link to that as well. So, as I said, two Cavern questions. One, is Cavern suitable for conducting risk assessment of public companies, i.e. SMB size, with under $1 billion in revenue? And then the second, is there an upper limit to the amount of servers, instances, accounts that the Cavern platform can manage? Anupam, you probably want to answer those.
Yeah, so in terms of the limit, in terms of the instances that we can assess, the Cavern platform is a microservices-based scalable architecture that can scale up literally from a small business environment with, let's say, hundreds of resources to large enterprises, public sector companies with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of resources. So that's the way it's been designed. We've gone through multiple evolutions of the platform and have reached a very scalable platform solution now. In terms of whether it's suitable for, I think I answered the question about whether it's suitable for public companies. Yes, it's a scalable platform that allows you to do that.
Okay, one other that came in is, if I bought the framework solution, where are you storing the data? Is this a web-based solution?
So there are multiple ways of deploying Cavirin. You can deploy it in your private cloud or your on-premises so that everything is within your periphery. You can also have an AWS-based SaaS deployment, and again, the AWS could be your AWS account. So there are multiple approaches depending on your desire and deployment requirements. We can work with you to make it happen.
Okay, and then maybe this one's for Praveen. If I'm SOX compliant, how long would it take to adopt the NIST framework?
Sure. So basically, if you have to do a mapping between SOX and NIST first, find out how much of overlap there is, and then determine what is your current state and the desired state. NIST doesn't really tell you that what should be your desired state. It is something for you to identify that what is your desired state. So if your desired state is to be SOX compliant, then I think your NIST framework sounds good. So it is basically between an overlap between SOX and NIST, and then you decide what is your security target.
And Praveen's line just dropped. But,
okay.
I think what he was saying, yeah,
if I can summarize,
it.
what he was saying is that it's really dependent on your target desired state. So what that means is that, let's say you assess your current security and risk posture, and you find that you have a number of gaps from a SOX implementation perspective. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework allows you to determine the steps that are missing and how to get there from where you are. And using SOX as a control framework, you're able to implement those safeguarding controls to ensure that your risk posture is secure.
Okay, and very last but not least, and we're 1 minute beyond the end of the webinar as it is Cavern hiring folks who have worked on this framework previously? Yes, please go to our website and you'll see the job openings. We always hire great people. So with that, Anupam, any closing statement? And before that, just as I said, we'll be posting all the information. Check back on BrightTalk, and we'll also send it out to everyone via email with links. Anupam, any closing statement shortly?
Yeah, so thank you all for joining the webinar. This is, as I said earlier, it's a pretty involved topic. So please keep your questions coming, and we'll be happy to take it up with you in a group. And I'm sure that we will schedule more detailed sessions, webinar sessions around risk management and other topics related to NIST Cybersecurity Framework as it matures and adds more information. Thank you all for attending the webinar today.
Okay, thank you, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.